On the evening of March 9, 1992, the streets of a quiet Michigan town were coated in the final dustings of winter. Streetlights flickered overhead as the night crept in earlier than expected. Residents of the neighborhood were used to the sound of footsteps echoing along Birchwood Lane, mostly from nurses finishing late shifts at the regional hospital just a few blocks away. But that night, one of those footsteps faded before reaching home. Her name was Clara Whitlow, 29 years old, a dedicated night shift nurse and beloved member of the community. She waved goodbye to a colleague at 11:04 p.m., turned down her usual path, and was never seen again. There was no scream, no struggle reported, no signs of disarray. Her purse never turned up. Her shoes' white clogs weren't found scattered on the roadside. It was as if she had vanished mid. For years, the case remained one of those quietly whispered tragedies, one of those stories passed down among new nurses as a cautionary tale. Parents in town began driving their daughters home. Porch lights stayed on longer. But nothing ever led back to Clara. The town changed over the years. The hospital expanded. Birchwood Lane got repaved. People moved on, though her photo remained tacked to the faded bulletin board in the hospital lounge, a gentle smile behind tired eyes. Still missing since March 9, 1992, the caption read, "After a decade of silence, even her closest friends began to resign themselves to the fact that she was gone forever." Police files gathered dust. Her parents stopped making public pleas. Time did what it always does. It dulled the sharp edges of loss into something quieter, heavier. But then came the storm. 14 years later, in the spring of 2006, a group of hikers veered off the usual trail through Dunlow Forest, just north of town. It was a warm April afternoon, and the woods smelled of wet earth and pine. A teenager, looking for a place to relieve himself, wandered into a thicket and stumbled upon something half buried beneath a fallen log. It wasn't a body. It wasn't clothes. It was a diary. Faded leather cover. A hospital badge tucked into the back flap. A name etched on the first page in careful blue ink. Clara Whitlow. And just like that, the town of Havenfield woke up. Her story wasn't over, not yet. Because inside that diary were the final, haunting pages Clara had ever written. Pages that would reignite one of Michigan's most baffling cold cases and uncover things about Clara no one could have imagined. This is the story of a woman who vanished without a trace, and the words she left behind. When the diary was brought to the Havenfield Police Department, officers treated it at first like just another false lead, one of many over the past 14 years. But that changed quickly. The badge number embedded in the hospital ID matched Clara Whitlow's file exactly. More chillingly, the handwriting on the pages had already been verified against a sample from a thank you note Clara once wrote to a patient's family. It was hers, no question, and the last entry was dated March 9, 1992, the night she vanished. For the first time in over a decade, there was something tangible in this case, something real, something she had touched. News spread like wildfire. Local stations aired grainy photos of Clara. Her parents, aged and quiet now, were interviewed from their small farmhouse. Clara's mother clutched a rosary and smiled gently, as if part of her had always known her daughter was still out there, somewhere waiting to be found. The diary, kept sealed in an evidence bag, became the center of renewed interest. It was transferred to the state lab for preservation and analysis. And one phrase, found scrawled in the margins of the final page, began to haunt the investigators. "He watches me from the trees." Detectives who had long since moved on were pulled back into the orbit of the case. A new task force was formed, combining local officers with outside experts in cold cases. The first step was to retrace Clara's known route the night she disappeared, from the staff exit of Havenfield Regional Hospital, down Birchwood Lane, across the small footbridge that led into the wooded shortcut behind her apartment complex. It was along this route, investigators speculated, where she must have encountered whoever or whatever had been watching her. Back in 1992, the search for Clara had been frantic, but dived bloodhounds lost her scent near the bridge. Volunteers combed the woods, but weather conditions had been poor, and the terrain difficult. At the time, Dunlow Forest hadn't been thoroughly mapped. Much of it was dense, overgrown, and private property. Today, with satellite imaging and newer trails in place, it became possible to explore deeper into the woods, and that's when the team found the second clue. About 30 yards from where the diary was discovered, they found a tree marked with deep horizontal guides. Nearby, an old rusted flashlight was buried beneath the leaves, still faintly stamped with HRH, short for Havenfield Regional Hospital. A few meters beyond that, tangled in the roots of a fallen pine, was a shredded piece of fabric. DNA testing would later confirm it had Clara's blood on it. The woods that had once silenced her voice were beginning to speak. This was no longer just a case of a woman who walked home and disappeared. This was the start of something deeper, a timeline of fear, possibly stalking, and a night that might have played out far differently than anyone had imagined. The discovery of Clara's diary and the bloodied scrap of fabric reignited more than just a cold case. It stirred a collective memory in the town of Havenfield. People who had long buried their suspicions began calling in, recounting odd sightings from years past. Strange cars parked along Birchwood Lane, unfamiliar men seen loitering near the hospital parking lot. Most of these stories had gone unreported back in the early 90s, dismissed as nothing at the time. But in the light of the diary's ominous final entry, he watches me from the trees. Every minor detail suddenly carried weight. Investigators re-examined the original witness list. One stood out. An elderly man named Leonard Mayers, who lived near the wooded shortcut Clara often used. Back in 1992, he'd told police he heard something strange that night, a woman's voice, muffled but urgent, followed by a short cry and then silence. At the time, police found no supporting evidence and chalked it up to imagination. But now, with physical clues from that very forest emerging, Leonard's memory became a thread worth pulling. Leonard, now in his 80s and bedridden, was re-interviewed. His account had not changed. Around 11:15 p.m., he'd stepped out to let his dog into the yard and heard what he thought was someone in distress. It wasn't a scream exactly, he recalled, more like someone calling out, and then stopping mid-sentence, like something or someone cut it off. When asked why he hadn't pursued it, he said simply, "I thought it was a fox fight, or teenagers playing." You don't expect the worst until the worst is all that's left. Investigators next focused on the CB radio chatter logs from 1992. Yes, they existed. Local truckers often used CB radios, and one station near the edge of Dunlow Forest picked up intermittent audio that night. Among the logs, they found a transmission recorded at 11:19 p.m., garbled static, followed by what sounded like a faint, panicked help. It wasn't clear enough to confirm the voice, but the timing lined up chillingly with Leonard's account. The deeper the task force dug, the more they realized how incomplete the original investigation had been. Key areas of the woods were never searched. The hospital's employee records hadn't been cross-referenced with known offenders. And then there was the maintenance worker Gerald Duffy. Gerald had worked at Havenfield Regional Hospital from 1990 to 1993, overlapping perfectly with Clara's time there. His file had been overlooked in the original investigation due to a clerical error. He'd been listed as a night porter, but in truth, he worked in groundskeeping and often handled equipment near the staff exits. He left town abruptly 3 months after Clara vanished. No forwarding address, no family ties. And one more thing, the final page of Clara's diary, just above the haunting line about being watched, mentioned a name in passing. Gary was outside again, smoking, I think. He gives me the creeps. As the task force zeroed in on Gerald Duffy, a deeper profile began to emerge, one far more unsettling than anyone in Havenfield had realized back in 19. At the time, Gerald was a quiet man in his early 40s, lived alone in a trailer just outside the town limits, and had a reputation for being withdrawn but dependable. Nothing in his record immediately flagged concern. No arrests, no formal complaints. But as investigators dug through archived personnel files, they found several informal notes made by his supervisors, minor warnings about inappropriate comments toward female staff, lingering near the exit doors after shifts, and refusing to take scheduled days off. One nurse had once reported that Gerald followed her to her car, but nothing came of it after she transferred departments. That nurse, it turns out, had worked the same floor as Clara Whit. More disturbing still, when investigators tracked down the trailer where Gerald had lived, they found it long abandoned. The landowner, now deceased, had allowed the property to decay. But in a dusty file box, retrieved from the home's remnants, there were several notebooks filled with incoherent writings, ramblings about shadows, the light behind the trees, and multiple female names, some with hearts scribbled next to them. Among the names, written and circled 3 times, was Clara. The FBI was brought in to assist in creating a psychological profile. While nothing directly tied Gerald to Clara's disappearance, no fingerprints, no DNA, his sudden exit from town 3 months after the event raised eyebrows. Further investigation found that Gerald had applied for a job as a janitor at a hospital in Iowa under a different name just weeks later. He'd worked there for less than a year before vanishing again. From that point on, he was a ghost. But the case wasn't just about Gerald anymore. Clara's diary hinted at more than just one unsettling encounter. In earlier entries, she spoke of feeling followed, of having recurring dreams about the woods, and of hearing someone whisper her name as she walked home. At first, she chalked it up to exhaustion and overwork. But one entry, dated February 29th, just 10 days before she vanished, read, "Something is wrong on Birchwood. Last night I felt it again. Someone's out there." The psychological impact on the investigators grew heavier as they read more. Clara had sensed it. She had known something was building. Yet like so many women who've had their instincts minimized, she kept showing up to work, kept walking home alone, and kept trusting the safety of her routine. The town of Havenfield, once again faced with the fragile nature of safety, watched from the sidelines as news crews returned. The words unsolved, trail gone cold, and possible serial pattern began to circulate, but Clara's voice preserved in the pages of her diary was finally guiding the story now. For the next several months, investigators followed lead after lead, each one fainter than the last. Gerald Duffy remained untraceable. No new aliases surfaced. No family came forward. The trail ran cold somewhere near the Iowa state line, and it stayed that way. Meanwhile, Clara's diary was subjected to forensic document examination. Experts confirmed that the final entries were likely written within an hour of her disappearance. Based on ink degradation and the pressure marks left on the paper, one detail stood out. The last 3 pages had been written hastily, words slanting, pressure increasing with each sentence, almost as if Clara was writing while in a heightened state of fear or panic. This insight added urgency to a question that had always lingered. Had Clara sensed she was in danger that night? And if so, was the diary her last attempt to be remembered, to leave a clue behind? The town entered what the media would soon call the silent years. From 2007 to 2014, the case remained technically open but dormant. There were no new tips. The woods yielded nothing further. The area where the diary had been found became overgrown again, nature reclaiming what had once spoken so loudly. Clara's name would occasionally resurface in local memory anniversary articles in small newspapers. Memorial masses at the local church, a candle left beneath her photo at the hospital bulletin board. But for the most part, the story went quiet. And then came the anonymous letter. It arrived at the Havenfield Police Department on May 2, 2014, no return address, postmarked from a small town in Montana. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, typewritten. It read, "The diary was never meant to be found, but you did. Look again beneath the roots. There's more she left behind." The message sent shivers through the task force, some of whom had moved on to other roles, but remained connected to the case. The phrasing "you did" implied the sender had knowledge of the diary's discovery. More disturbingly, it suggested Clara had left behind other messages, other evidence. A new search was organized that same month. This time, a cadaver dog unit was brought in, along with ground-penetrating radar and a team of volunteers trained in cold case recovery. The focus returned to Dunlow Forest, specifically the area around the fallen log where the diary had been found. The roots of that tree had expanded and hardened over the years, but with careful excavation, something was uncovered. A small metal tin, rusted and sealed with tape. Inside were 5 Polaroid photographs, grainy and faded, but one image was unmistakable. Clara, in her nurse's scrubs, standing on Birchwood Lane. The photo appeared to have been taken from a distance, possibly through a window or from the edge of the woods. She wasn't smiling. She looked tired. Her eyes glanced toward something out of frame. On the back of the photo, written in shaky handwriting, was one line. "He's not who you think." The photographs in the tin marked a grim turning point. Until that moment, everything investigators knew about Clara's disappearance had come from second-hand reports, circumstantial details, and her own fading diary entries. But now, staring at those eerie Polaroids, they had undeniable proof. Someone had been watching her. Someone had been following her closely enough to capture candid, personal moments Clara likely never knew were being documented. The presence of these photos, hidden intentionally, suggested she may have discovered them herself and stashed them as evidence. It also meant that she'd had at least some awareness of who was behind the stalking. The most haunting photo, however, wasn't of Clara at all. It was a blurry image of a man standing near the hospital's loading dock, his face obscured by motion blur and poor lighting. He wore a jacket with reflective tape, the kind worn by maintenance workers. Though not definitive, the silhouette bore a disturbing resemblance to early photos of Gerald Duffy. But the true shock came when one of the remaining Polaroids was enhanced digitally. In the far background of Clara's photo, standing behind her on Birchwood Lane, was a faint shape, a tall figure near the tree line, almost indistinguishable from the shadows. When contrast was applied, the figure became clearer. He was watching her. Speculation ran wild. Was the man in the background Gerald or someone else entirely? Why would Clara keep these photos hidden in the woods? Was she planning to turn them in? Or had she been planning to flee? The investigation took a darker turn. A journalist working for a regional cold case blog reached out to the task force with a claim that he'd received an anonymous tip years ago about a man named J.D., who used to hunt the walking in the Dunlow woods. The phrase was odd, but it stuck with the team. A deeper dive into Gerald Duffy's past revealed he had once been cited for trespassing on private land as a teenager, armed with a bow. He claimed he was hunting deer. No charges were filed. The idea that Gerald or someone like him may have been using the woods to stalk unsuspecting women was chilling. But without definitive evidence, the case still hung in the air, unsolved and agonizing. The statute of limitations on many related crimes had long since expired. Yet Clara's disappearance remained open because her body was never found. The hope, small as it was, lingered. By 2015, the town of Havenfield had changed again. New housing developments edged closer to the forest. Birchwood Lane saw more traffic. The hospital underwent renovations, and the old staff exit Clara once used was sealed off. Yet her story remained present, shared in whispers at the nurses' station, told 2 new hires, honored during annual safety briefings. Her photo was reprinted and placed near the new staff lounge, beneath a small plaque that read, "In memory of those who walk home and never arrive." But the case wasn't closed, not even close. Because one final page in Clara's diary, once thought blank, was found to contain faint indentations, and when enhanced under specialized lighting, a hidden message was revealed. The discovery of the hidden message on what was believed to be a blank final page of Clara's diary shifted the case once again. Forensic specialists used an electrostatic detection device, a tool typically reserved for uncovering indentations in paper, to bring the faded impressions to light. The words, written with a trembling hand and likely under immense stress, read, "He followed me to the old mill. If anything happens, start there." The old mill. 2 locals. The name alone stirred unease. Located on the outskirts of Havenfield, the Dunlow textile mill had been abandoned since the 1970s after a fire gutted half the structure. It stood like a forgotten relic of another era, rusted beams, shattered windows, and vines snaking through the cracks. Teens sometimes dared each other to explore its interior, but most stayed away, claiming it was haunted, cursed, or just too dangerous to enter. Until Clara's message, the mill had never been considered relevant to her case. Within days of the revelation, the task force obtained permission to search the mill. Accompanied by cadaver dogs, drones, and structural engineers, the team entered the crumbling building with cautious determination. The search was slow, the structure unstable in places. But eventually the team reached the basement level once used for storage, now filled with debris and water damage. It was there, beneath a pile of collapsed ceiling panels and dust-coated crates, that they found a small metal box. Inside were items that hadn't seen the light of day in over a decade: a cracked wristwatch, an old hospital ID badge with Clara's photo, and a bundle of notes seemingly torn from journals or loose pages. Some were barely legible, water-stained and aged, but a few still carried Clara's voice. Fragments about fear, about not feeling safe, about seeing the same man near the staff exit 3 nights in a row. And then there was the note that simply said, "He has keys." It was the most damning piece of evidence to date. Gerald Duffy, in his role as groundskeeper, would have had access to staff keys, including those to the back exits and utility paths. This detail had never come to light before. It gave weight to the theory that Clara's abduction had been premeditated, carefully planned by someone who knew her schedule, her habits, and the vulnerabilities of the hospital's layout. The mill was now considered a secondary crime scene. Forensic crews combed through every square inch of the basement. Though no human remains were discovered, they did find traces of blood on the underside of one wall beam. Testing revealed it was too degraded for definitive results, but consistent with a human profile. The DNA was preserved for future comparison. Meanwhile, the town buzzed with renewed conversation. News vans returned. Cold case podcasts picked up the story. The haunting question returned to everyone's lips. What really happened to Clara Whitlow? As forensic teams finalized their sweep of the old mill, the task force turned its attention back to the town itself. Havenfield had changed, but memories lingered. More people began to come forward. A former hospital janitor, long retired and living in New Brunswick, reached out after seeing the news coverage. He remembered Gerald Duffy vividly. Said he always found excuses to stay late, often lingering near the vending machines by the staff exit. He wasn't rude, the man recalled, but there was something off, like he was always listening, never blinking. But it was a woman named Denise Holloway who brought a breakthrough. Denise had worked night shifts in the same hospital ward as Clara during early 1992. She'd been a float nurse, moving between departments. She hadn't spoken out back then, fearing retribution. But the years had shifted that fear into guilt. During a recorded interview, Denise recounted several late-night conversations with Clara in the break room. "She told me she didn't feel safe walking home anymore," Denise said. "She thought someone was watching her apartment, said she was going to start writing things down, just in case." That one detail, writing things down, aligned perfectly with the contents of the hidden tin, and with the diary itself. Clara had been aware of the threat for longer than anyone thought. She hadn't ignored it. She'd tried to leave a trail, and she may have known more than she ever had the chance to say. A handwriting analyst brought in to review the diary, and the mill pages confirmed that Clara's tone became more erratic and urgent in the final days before she vanished. The entries shifted from personal reflection to a kind of real-time documentation, times, names, strange patterns. One page from the mill bundle included this passage: "He never clocks out, always there, even when he's not on the list." Why? Hospital logs from 1992 were cross-referenced again. Sure enough, Gerald Duffy had been present in the building several nights when he wasn't officially scheduled. One such night, March 9th, the night Clara vanished. With this new evidence, a federal warrant was issued to search for any trace of Gerald across nationwide employment databases. A match came back almost immediately. Under a slightly altered name, Jerome Dufina, man, fitting Gerald's description, had worked at a warehouse in Wyoming from 2005 to 2009. But he'd disappeared again, resigning without notice, no forwarding address. Then came the real break. A fingerprint pulled from the rusted flashlight found near Clara's diary, long stored but never fully analyzed, was retested using advanced techniques. It wasn't a full print, but it yielded a partial match. Enough to confirm it belonged to Gerald Duffy. It was the first physical link between Gerald and the crime scene. And with that match, the case transitioned. No longer just a disappearance, not merely a mystery. It was now officially classified as a suspected homicide. The official reclassification of Clara Whitlow's case as a suspected homicide sent shockwaves through Havenfield and far beyond. With Gerald Duffy now publicly named as the primary suspect, a nationwide manhunt began. His photo, aged through software to match what he might look like in his 70s, was circulated through every major news outlet and law enforcement agency in the US and Canada. A $50,000 reward was announced for any information leading to his arrest. Tips flooded in. Most were false leadsmen mistaken for Duffy in bus stations, grocery stores, trailer parks. But one call, made anonymously from a payphone in Helena, Montana, stood out. The caller claimed that an old guy named Gary had lived in a remote cabin outside the city, rarely came into town, and spoke with a whispery, unplaceable accent. The local sheriff's office investigated, but the cabin had been abandoned for at least 6 months. Inside, they found little dusty furniture, expired canned goods, and in the fireplace, a half-burned box of papers. Among the charred remains was a singed photograph of Clara Whitlow's face, partially scorched, but unmistakable. The FBI escalated the case to top priority. Clara's family, who had endured years of silence and empty hope, now faced a grim truth. She had likely been hunted, abducted, and possibly killed by someone she saw nearly every day, someone who should have never had access to her. As for Clara's final hours, investigators now believe she was intercepted on her walk home the night of March 9, 1992, most likely near the hospital's rear path through Birchwood Lane. Gerald Duffy, using his staff keys and knowledge of her routine, had likely been waiting. For how long, no one could say. The working theory was that he coerced her toward the woods, possibly under false pretenses, maybe claiming he needed help, or that something had happened near the mill. There was still no body. But for the first time, investigators had a clear suspect, a reconstructed timeline, and enough circumstantial and physical evidence to pursue charges if Duffy could be found alive. Then, in late 2016, a call came from a hospital in Spokane, Washington. A man in his early 70s had been admitted with heart failure, unconscious and without identification. When he regained lucidity, he gave a fake name. But a nurse noticed an unusual tattooing anchor with the initials GD beneath it. She searched the initials online, and Clara Whitlow's case appeared immediately. Police were called. A fingerprint confirmed the impossible. Gerald Duffy had been found. But fate intervened once more. Before he could be interrogated, he fell into a coma. He would never wake up again. He died 2 days later, taking whatever secrets he still held with him to the grave. Though the legal system would never try him, Clara's family and the entire town finally had the closest thing to closure they could hope for. The monster had a name, and justice, though imperfect, had stirred at last. The announcement of Gerald Duffy's death was met with a complicated wave of emotion across Havenfield. Some residents felt relief, others, frustration. For Clara Whitlow's family, it was a bittersweet ending to a 24-year nightmare. They would never get answers to the most haunting questions. What exactly happened to Clara that night? Did she suffer? Where is she now? In the months following Duffy's death, a memorial service was held for Clara. Though her body had never been found, the community gathered to honor her memory, as if she had finally been laid to rest. Former co-workers, friends, and townspeople who had only known her through news reports came together at the hospital chapel. The same hallway where her missing person flyer had once hung was now home to a framed tribute. Her photo beside a candle and a small plaque that read, "She walked home for the last time, but she never walked alone." The impact of Clara's story reached far beyond Havenfield. News outlets covered the case's resolution, sparking nationwide conversations about workplace safety, the dangers of ignored instincts, and the quiet patterns of stalking behavior often overlooked. Clara's diary entries were eventually published with permission from her family, in a special edition of the Journal of Women's Safety and Advocacy. Her words, haunting, clear, and eerily predictive, became the voice of countless other women who never got the chance to speak. In response, the Havenfield Hospital established the Clara Whitlow Initiative, a safety protocol named in her honor. It included mandatory chaperones for staff walking to parking areas after dark, 24/7 security monitoring, and anonymous reporting systems for workplace harassment and stalking. Her story, once a cold case gathering dust, had now changed institutional policy and public awareness forever. But perhaps the most poignant legacy came from the smallest item of all, Clara's diary. It now sits in a sealed glass display at the Havenfield Historical Museum, preserved not just as evidence, but as a testament. Beneath it, a simple inscription reads, "She wrote so she wouldn't be forgotten." She wasn't. To this day, new nurses at the hospital hear her story during orientation. Locals still walk past the bench that bears her name near Birchwood Lane, and every March 9th, candles flicker in windows across town, not out of fear, but in remembrance. The forest never gave back her body, but it gave back her voice. And in doing so, it gave closure to a story that refused to remain buried.